Hello and welcome to another Total Education Media Centre production. Today I want to talk to you about belonging, and I know we're probably all sick about belonging at this stage, but it is an important part of the exams, and you need to really focus on belonging as a topic for both first section, second section and third section of paper 1. I'd like to talk to you today about belonging as a total concept and not really focus on anything in specific, but get you to work your way through belonging and be able to walk into that exam with absolute confidence. This is only a short lecture, and don't forget you can visit the Total Education Centre website at totaleducationcentre.com.au, where there are several lectures for each specific part of the paper that will certainly assist you in passing that exam. They also have notes with those that will help you get through if you need notes rather than the oral lectures. The first thing I recommend to students in belonging is go to the Board of Studies rubric and examine it very closely. You'll find that the Board of Studies outlines very clearly in that rubric, in the syllabus and in the annotations of text, exactly what you're supposed to be studying. And if you haven't seen that, you really need to go to that. That's the very first and most important thing that I would do as a student in attempting the belonging section of the paper. The board points out in particular a few different things and a few different approaches that they expect you to take for belonging so that you can do the best in the exam that you possibly can, which is what we want you to do as well. The next thing that I'd suggest to do once you've looked at the Board of Studies and worked out what they want, and they talk about things like identity and connections and things like that, is work out your own definition of belonging. You really need to have your own working definition of belonging. And it's not one from a dictionary, it's one that you need to be able to work out and understand clearly and completely and be able to put into probably the first paragraph of your essay. And you'll use it in paper 1 as well, not in the creative writing, but in answering the short answer questions. A clearly defined position on belonging on your own half will certainly help you get through that first section of the paper because you go into it with a very clear understanding of where you should be. Think about other terms when you think about belonging so you don't have to repeat yourself. And I'll talk about this a little bit later in this short lecture. You need to think in terms of identity perhaps, relationships, acceptance and understanding. And those things are very clearly pointed out in the board's rubric and you can read through those at your own leisure. I'd like you to think also about not belonging. And it's termed not belonging by most people, but I prefer the terms alienation and I prefer the term estrangement. Alienation and estrangement are two specific aspects of not belonging that you should really focus on because in your other related material you might wish to focus on those as a compare and contrast to your main set text. I'd come from the viewpoint, and if I was doing this myself, I'd come from the viewpoint very clearly that belonging is a natural state of being for most people. I think you'll find from your own observations through growing up in life that belonging is a very important part, and making connections with other people is a very important part of the human experience. And I think one of the focuses that you need to have in both your set text and in your other related material is how people specifically make connections to each other and what those connections are, how those connections begin, how they might end, and the sort of things that people do to form connections. It's also important to find synonyms, and there are a whole list of synonyms you can, so you're not using the word belonging constantly all the time. Belonging in every sentence that you use, in every second word that you use in your essay. You also should consider when you think about the connections that I've just talked about and how people relate to each other or are estranged from each other, is exactly how they do that and what changes you need to make to your life and perhaps even changes to your identity and the way that you have connections with people, how that affects your text and your other related text. Some people need to change their identity considerably to join in and fit in with people and make those certain connections. Other people can be themselves and still form plenty of connections because they're social beings. It's a very interesting aspect and one sort of different way to look at it that other students might not do. What else can we look at? I think specifically you need to look at the concept of the outsider and the concept of the idea of exclusion and work out some people choose to be excluded, some people choose to be an outsider, some people want to look different, some people want to act differently. They choose to go on the outside of the norms, they choose to be on the outside of society even. And there are different aspects of that about belonging that you can integrate into your work. And perhaps in your other related text, you might like to find examples of that and use those in your essay as a contrast to what you've done before. I think if you focus on, in this section of the paper, about what makes connections and how people make connections, that's going to be the most important thing you can do. And I think it's those connections are very different. And depending on your text and what sort of set text that you're using, you could talk about making connections over time with those ideas, and certainly talk about how the changing world, the rapidly changing world, has certainly changed the way that we make connections and exactly how those connections are made. And for example, something like Facebook, which is a pretty simple thing, and you can certainly visit the Total Education Centre on Facebook now. You can go there and get some different offers and bargains if you visit our Facebook site. But Facebook's certainly a different way of connecting with the world, and a way that didn't happen perhaps 20 years ago. And there are different methods like, Pinterest and Instagram and all those sort of Snapchat, all those different ways that now people make connections. They're very, very important. And you need to think about those sorts of things when you come into contact with belonging. What else have we got? I'd like to talk for a short while about belonging in your texts, and I'll probably call this short segment Belonging in Your Texts. Belonging is an artificial concept forced upon us. Not many of the creators of these texts would have gone out and said, I'm going to write this text about belonging. This text is all about belonging. It's a concept sort of forced upon us by the Board of Studies, and what we have to do is work out how belonging fits in with that text and how it's integrated into it. And that's why I asked you to work in the first part of this lecture to work at your own definition of belonging and see certainly how that can fit into your text, because that will give you a different approach to everybody else who's just done the same basic things year after year. The texts were chosen to have elements of belonging in them, obviously, so they do. So any text that you do will fit, and if you say, oh, this text doesn't have belonging, in the set text picked by the Board of Studies, you would be incorrect, and they certainly do have it, and there's plenty to talk about in there. Finding the belonging's just not enough. You need to make those connections, as I said, and finding the connections is just as important as finding the belonging, because they're nearly the same thing. But what you have to do is then talk about how that belonging is conveyed by the author, and that's extremely important. And I think most students that get up into that B range are certainly going to talk about how belonging is conveyed by the author or the creator of that text, be it the director or whatever. I think that is very important, but you need to then take it another step. You need to talk about the purpose of the text. And in our case, obviously, that purpose is somewhat belonging, but the effect then that has on the audience. And I think all the A range responses certainly have a constant purpose in their essay, but they also talk about the purpose of the composer and the effect that it has on his audience and what he's trying to achieve, or she is trying to achieve, in composing that text and putting it out there for people to view. Look for connections obviously between people and people, but you can also look for people and places and make those connections as well. And many of the texts are more about people making connections in places and to places than they are with people. Another facet that you might want to consider is how people begin to belong over time and change over time. Sometimes characters in some of the texts set for study don't belong and then they belong, and other times they belong and then they're alienated, and there's all sorts of variations in between. And you need to look at that factor and think about time and think about place, because they're very important aspects of belonging, and they will certainly impact on what you do. I think the idea of that slow growing acceptance, as Billy has in Simple Gift, for example, is a very important aspect. And you'll tie that into the last point I made, that the ability to change your sense of belonging and change it over time. You can certainly prepare in advance for this question, and I'm not suggesting in any way, shape or form that you prepare an essay, but certainly when you walk into paper one, and if you're doing a text, you can certainly know everything about that text, and you can certainly know everything about your other related text, and prepare those things very carefully and make sure that then they integrate into that question. My suggestion to all students would be to have a couple of pieces of other related material that you can adapt and move in. You might be asked to write about one, which is the common. You might be asked to write about two, perhaps, but not likely. But it's better to have a couple of pieces of material that you can adapt and adjust to suit the needs of the essay, rather than go in there with one thing and you've only got one focus, and if it doesn't suit, you're struggling and you get all nervous and your essay becomes wrecked and destroyed. Finally, if you want to have a look at the Total Education website, there are past papers on belonging, lots and lots of practice questions, and the best thing about that is there's certainly answers with those, so you can do the practice questions, look at your own answers, compare them to the answers that were excellent answers and got excellent results, and teachers' recommended answers, and work on your responses to those questions and develop your ideas and understandings. Remember also, there are the Here to Succeed lecture series where we have lots of belonging talks. So really, they're the basic tips for belonging. They're the things that you should be focused on as you move into the exam period. There are, of course, specific talks on text that you'll need to do, and you could go to the Learn to Succeed lecture series to hear those. But overall, thanks for listening. That's the basics of belonging. Good luck in the future.